You're listening to a Thames Estuary Partnership podcast, celebrating London's famous tidal river. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, and welcome back to another inspiring episode of Talk of the Thames. I'm your host, Chloe Russell, and today we have the honour of sitting down with an extraordinary guest who has dedicated his life's work to making the world a better place. Joining us today is none other than Professor Jules Pretty, a leading environmentalist, writer, and academic with a profound passion for sustainable living and environmental well-being. With a distinguished career that spans decades, Professor Pretty has been a trailblazer in addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing our planet. He is the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Low Carbon Good Life, which explores innovative solutions to combat the climate crisis, tackle inequality, preserve biodiversity, and promote healthier food choices. Through his work, Professor Pretty has demonstrated how a low-carbon lifestyle can lead to greater happiness and contentment while safeguarding our precious natural resources. As the director of the Centre for Public and Policy Engagement and the chair of the Essex Climate Action Group, Professor Pretty has been at the forefront of driving positive change and inspiring others to take action on issues they deeply care about. His unique blend of storytelling and scientific evidence has captivated audiences worldwide, making him a highly sought-after speaker, educator, and thought leader in the realm of sustainability and environmental advocacy. So, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Jules Pretty to Talk of the Thames. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, a big warm welcome to author and professor Jules Pretty. How are you doing today?
Very good, Chloe. Nice to be on with you.
Yeah, it's such an honour. I mean, I was reading all your credentials and my mind was just going like, pew, pew, pew. It's just like amazing. You've accomplished so much.
It's because I'm old and ready to go to the grave now. So that's what it is.
No, don't be daft. But honestly, I have so many questions and I don't know if we can fit it all in, but I really wish that we can because I'm just so curious. Like, can you tell us about your journey and how you became interested in the intersection of nature and well-being and sustainability? Like, what's your story?
Well, I think initial training was in kind of systems biology and ecology and the way that kind of systems and systematics work and how agro-ecosystems build up and how ecosystems, the components interact with each other. So that kind of starting with the kind of ecology of systems naturally leads into thinking about what happens at the edge of systems, what happens between them, and what happens between natural systems and human cultural social systems. So I've always been interested in that intersection between natural systems and human ones, which, you know, many indigenous people, for example, would say there's no separate systems there. They're the same system. The natural and the human and the cultural is all of the same space. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But we see them as slightly different, certainly in terms of kind of disciplines and analysis and understanding. And so the interesting space is amongst those. It's where we understand the problems of the world. That's where we understand the opportunities and pathways for positive change in the future, comes from the connection between the natural and the cultural worlds, really.
And you're branching this into so many projects and organisations. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on? Where have you got your head in all these places?
Well, I think the big thing at the moment has to be climate crisis. It ought to be the one for everybody, really, because that's the biggest near and present danger. But it's also a kind of global threat that touches upon every aspect of our lives. It's not as if it's a sectoral one, like saying, we have a problem with our food system or we have a problem with oak trees or something like that. It's by definition touching every aspect of our lives. And the critical thing that we face at the moment is just a kind of window for getting it right before, if we haven't done an awful lot by 2030 or even kind of maybe the early 2030s, a substantial impact upon kind of total emissions, we will have passed some really serious negative tipping points, and there's no coming back from those. And we're kind of teetering on the edge of some of those at the moment. But I'm still kind of optimistic that the message is being received, that the institutions are being built, that the actions are being developed, that there's a lot of people who feel as though they want to take action, that they want to express agency in helping to kind of forge a new path. And I think that's quite encouraging. I think that wasn't the case before COVID. I think that's partly related to the global nature of a pandemic that affected every human in the world. And we all knew it. But I certainly see from public talks that I give that people are really wanting to take action, but they're not quite sure what to do. And they would like some guidance as to where's the best place to begin. What should I do? What should someone else do? How can you create kind of bottom-up action? And there's something really interesting happening in this country, but also in lots of other countries in kind of making some quite substantial steps towards the kind of platforms we need for this big transformation that is awaiting us.
Can you give me some examples of that? I'm very curious.
Well, if the kind of major contributors to the total fossil fuel emissions, 55 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent worldwide, the big areas are nutrition, so food, production as well as consumption, housing, energy, transport, consumption of goods and services, are the kind of the big areas. And in each of those, there are things that we need to do. We need to transition away from using fossil fuels to move us around, and to get into kind of electrification. We need to change the nature of our diets in order to reduce impact. We need to change, obviously, towards 100% renewables, which for some one would guess, particularly looking at the kind of national debate here in this country, it seems like a really difficult thing. But there are a number of countries that are at 100% renewable now. Iceland, Norway, Albania, Costa Rica, Paraguay, Uruguay. They're at 100%, and they've been untouched by the energy crisis because they don't use fossil fuels anymore. In their kind of energy sector. I mean, obviously, lots of countries are still burning fossil fuels to drive around. But then if you look at Norway, 85% of their vehicles are EVs now. So that's the second transformation that comes. You get the renewables right. You get the energy sector transformed. And then you can kind of change the transport system. So in every one of those areas, there are small steps being taken, but big steps possible. So I think that's where one feels a little bit of confidence for it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And you've really given us like a very good flavour of your interest so far. And I'm wondering, so what motivates and inspires you to continue your work in the field? Is it these advances that are happening? They're quite exciting.
Yes, I mean, I think it's both the recovery of nature that has been kind of substantially damaged by us, especially in recent years. So when nature is in kind of full bloom, as it were. I mean, it's a fantastic thing. It's just a kind of glory of the world is lying out there awaiting us, but we have depleted it very badly. So that's one part of the motivation comes from knowing that recovery is possible, but knowing what it looks like when it's there, or knowing what it looks like when it's untouched, when things haven't been damaged by human actions. And then secondly, there's the kind of human transformations. There are our own transformations that are possible. Each of us is going on a life journey in each of our lives, and we need a similar sort of heroic journey for our economies and cultures. We've got to make these huge transformations, big shifts that are analogous to going from, small school to big school, from big school to college to your first job, your first child, the first death in the family, your own death, which will come later on, retirement in the middle of all. These big kind of transition points in our own lives are rather like the big transition points in, the planet's life. And what we've got to do now is to make this great transformation, this great transgression in our economies, to do something completely new and different before the crisis strikes. So if we think of it as an heroic journey, then we should be kind of thinking, well, yes, we can do this. We can kind of get together, and it's up to us, we humans, all 8 billion of us. We can do this. So it's partly that as well, because that we feel kind of happy when we make change like that. That's where kind of contentment and happiness comes from, is that connection to nature, connection to other people, and a kind of sense of agency and capability, our own learning and our ways of influencing the world.
That was just so well said. That was so beautiful. I'm not surprised you're an author. That was very well said. Thank you. I really like this. I like that. I'm really enjoying that. I'm asking you personal questions, but you like to look at the broader picture. I think that's very refreshing. I really am enjoying that. I am going to go back to a more personal question within your professional career, because I'm curious. So when it comes to defining moments and milestones along your career, what have been some of the highlights?
Well, I think there are lots of them. I worked a lot in kind of developing participatory methods to work with poorer agricultural peoples in what was then called developing countries, but we would now say emerging economies, in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of that was about saying, if you listen to people, if you hear them in their places, they have knowledge and expertise and insights that you can't have as an outsider. So we need to listen. The whole thing about participation and public engagement is about listening, not telling. But a lot of our institutions, including our kind of scientific institutions, are very good at telling, about discovering stuff and saying, well, we need to tell people about it. Actually, sometimes you have to kind of listen.
Deficit model.
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of transformations happen in kind of specific environments, sleeping on a farmer's floor, eating food with people, going up a sacred mountain, talking to people in a particular coastal place, or, all those sorts of things. They feel like big moments to me, but they're also kind of, small transitions in developing your own knowledge system. So I can answer the question in that way. And the other way, it's working for IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development, in the early part of my career, working for the University of Essex, making kind of transitions in terms of different jobs when we kind of see them in front of us. The opportunities can look kind of big and scary because we haven't done them before. And then when you do them, you think, oh, that wasn't so bad. And that's kind of how I think of this big one that faces the planet for the climate transition. It looks big and scary. We're in the dark forest. We've never been here before, and we can't even see if there's a path because we've never been here before. But there are lots of paths. And once we start making those paths, we'll look back and say, well, that was all right, wasn't it? Because we got going on the problem in front of us. So I think things have changed a lot in recent years. As I said earlier on, 10 years ago, a lot of the effort, say if we're thinking 8 years ago with the Paris Agreement, a lot of effort was about persuading people that there was a problem in the first place.
Sure.
But now I think everyone gets that there's a problem. They might want to delay it or delay the action, pretend it's quite small, but mostly people get that there's a problem. So here we are in the dark forest. It's not very friendly, and we have to make the path. But I think once we get going, we'll find it's a lot easier than we conceive of at the moment.
I think that's such a interesting depiction as well. And I like the way that you use storytelling to convey that. That will lead me on to many more questions down the line. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. I would love to talk to you more about your work in Essex Climate Action Group. But before we go into that, I'm very curious. I know that you've got so many passions and projects and fingers and pies. And as soon as we came onto this chat, I was like, you've got so many books. And then you explained all these lovely interests of yours. And out of curiosity again, how do you balance your academic pursuits and writing and advocacy work? And do you have any strategies for integrating these different aspects on your professional life?
Yeah, I think there's probably not a simple answer to that. It's not kind of 8.4 kind of thing, or 42, or that's it is about kind of seeing the range of things that one works on as being connected. Obviously, you're making the connections as somebody who works upon them, and looking for synergies. So if you work on one thing, that's preparing you to be able to give a talk on this to somebody else. And if you give a talk and learn from the audience, that makes your initial work more interesting because you've come back with something from the talk that you've given. And then you need to take big leaps from time to time. So I think every books are interesting because, you would think in our highly online era that we find ourselves in that the things called books wouldn't survive, but they do because they're a thing, and they're like a play or they're like a film. It needs creating. It takes years to create, so you have to be at it for a long time. Sometimes people say, I can write a book in 4 weeks. So I go, that's interesting. Okay, that's great. That's not me. A book is a journey. It's a big old journey. And you start in one place and you don't know where you're going. That's what makes it interesting. A book's not very interesting if you have a structure and you stick to it and it comes out exactly as you planned it. That's just filling in the gaps. It's like doing a crossword kind of thing. So you want to be faced with uncertainty. And there is a little bit of a cliche which says, there's nothing more scary than a blank piece of paper or a blank screen. It's true, because we find it very difficult to not let the perfect obstruct the good. So when you are being creative, you have an idea of what it's going to look like at the end. And of course, because that's the perfect bit and you're not in perfection, you've got a big gap, and quite often you kind of hit the wall. And that's part of the kind of creative process as well. But I think you have to I've learned to put myself into that process and enjoy it, enjoy the uncertainty, enjoy the kind of creativity that comes out of the gap between things. The gap between one bird singing and another bird singing, that kind of moment of silence is when you're creative. That's when you can kind of come up with stuff. So, I mean, as you well know, I wrote a book called This Luminous Coast, which came out of walking around the whole of the coasts of Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk. And this was about, so this kind of 13 years ago, I was doing the work, 14 years ago, I was doing the work, and it lasted a whole year, the project. And I just conceived of it as an expedition to walk the coasts and to see what was there. And then that transformed into a project over the whole of a year. And so I walked about 400 miles in that particular project, but it was kind of being in places, talking to people, seeing different environments, sneaking up on places through the back door. If you're on the coast, most of this coast of East Anglia doesn't have the equivalent of a coastal road, a big sur that runs around the coast. To get to the coast, you go along like the spokes of a wheel. It's like half a wheel. So you go to one place and you come back again. But if you're walking around the edge, you're literally going around the edge. So you're going to places that people don't go to. So I kind of enjoy that uncertainty and putting myself physically in that. It's a kind of performative thing. Put yourself there. Things will happen. You're not quite sure what. Keep your eyes open, see what happens.
Yeah, there's like a lot of
scary,
Yeah, there's a lot of serendipity in there, and that's like so exciting.
Exactly so, absolutely.
Wow. Amazing. And there's a lot of self-discovery in there, not just so much in this project, but just in general. Like, I feel like in your career progression, I think in a lot of people's career progression, it's about self-discovery and drawing in those synergies. It's being open-minded and taking in all of this information, using it in stock and resources within yourself, and then building upon that. And that's a beautiful thing. It shouldn't be so rigid.
Exactly. And I think that goes for a kind of interest in the way the world works as well, is that's the similar kind of approach is that when we find ourselves in a tricky position, when things aren't looking good in a particular sector, or as we've just been talking about kind of globally with the climate crisis, this needs us to be able to think differently, and to do that with kind of kindness and hope and generosity, and not animosity, where things you don't create positive things when people are having a fight. You just kind of create winners and losers, and the planet needs winners and winners. You know, it needs something different from all of us.
Absolutely, very well said. I'm just wondering, do you think there is some sort of parallel with people that are very interested in nature and having this open-mindedness in their work? Because I feel like nature, there's like no boundaries. And then maybe with like being interested in the sector, you have to have that open mind of being like, it's like raw elements, you know, you use what you're presented with, and then there's like a sort of magic that you create, and then you can like propel that. And it's very like inspiring to other people that are in the field.
That's well put. Exactly so. I think that's exactly right, because the in noticing, in being attentive, I'm quite fond of the word attentive as a way of kind of understanding what's around us. So when we're attentive to nature and our environment, we become immersed in it very, very easily.
Yes.
You know, I'm looking outside here at a particular kind of view. And, you know, when you watch, then things happen. You know, a beetle flies out, a bat flies in the evening, a stag beetle comes along at this time of year. But you have to kind of settle into the landscape a little bit, let the attentiveness happen, and then the animals and plants will kind of come to you, as it were. You'll see things and you'll understand them in a particular way. So I do think it needs a kind of mental model of how you approach nature. And I'm not saying that's unique to me. I'm just saying anybody who is highly attentive will notice stuff. And then when we notice it, we notice when things are changing, when they're getting worse or better, what can be done about things. We then kind of overlay that with a sort of normative sense of how things could be and how they could be better, as opposed to when they're worse. I mean, it's very easy to get cross and angry about the state of things, the state of pollution of our rivers and waterways, the state of the climate crisis in its own way, the damage to biodiversity, the kind of destruction of indigenous communities, the greater inequality that we've seen. I mean, you know, we could give a great big list of them. When I talk to young people in particular, they all get it that the climate crisis is a real thing, much more than older people. They completely get it because they've been aware through their own formal teaching, but also their understanding of the world through media and social media. They know what's going on. But equally, in knowing what's happening, that makes them anxious because they don't know what to do about it. Especially when people say, this is really terrible and we don't know what to do. Then people are going, well, crikey, really? You know, I thought you made the problem, you adults. What are you going to do about it? So there is a kind of a need to say, not to fall into the trap of just saying how terrible everything is, even if it is pretty terrible. You know, so there's a tricky kind of state of affairs, because you know, one needs to be honest. We should be honest about how bad things are, but at the same time, you need to couple that to what we can do about things, as opposed to saying, you know, there's nothing to do with me, or this is a terrible problem and somebody should do something about it. That's not very helpful. Of course they should, but we have to kind of find a way to say, well, this is our kind of mental model of what good looks like, and then we need to kind of work back from good, like a zero emissions world, that's a good place to get to, isn't it? So how do we get there?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much food for thought in that. Yeah, you've got my brain thinking about all these things. Like, I mean, this is like one small stakeholder in that, but creative people, they can present the world in all these wonderful ways, and it's like, it's like science communication as well. It's just like one form of communication. That is actually a very good segue. I wanted to make a note that you've got so many communication methods yourself. You've obviously got the writing, you've got your own podcast, you've got the film series, you've got books, you've got academic papers. There's so many things. And you've obviously got a natural talent for communicating. And I'm just wondering, is this something that when you were little, did this form then? What was the spark that got you interested in all these wonderful ways of communicating your ideas?
I'm not sure what the spark was, but I don't think it. I would say these are all kind of learnt approaches. I mean, they're things that kind of emerge out of practice, out of doing things. So I don't think anybody probably starts off as a good public speaker. I think you work at it and you kind of get training and you go to speak to voice coaches. I had voice coach training and actor training in early days as to how to kind of learn to speak to people, body language training, how to use, your hands and your body when you're speaking, what you should do and what you shouldn't do. So the methods are there to learn, to help in kind of communication. But I think it's just a lot of practice, I think, probably. And I always have this kind of rule that when I've given a presentation, I've given something like 45 talks since last summer on,
oh my gosh.
these are regional talks on 2 villages and parishes and towns on the climate crisis and helping to form, which we can kind of come to in a moment, helping to form local institutions in the region. And it's always to learn something from every event so that you don't view it as simply a method for telling other people something and then going away again and forgetting about it. Is that if you are open to the audience and you're open to the context, interesting things will happen, sometimes not very good ones. And, you think, oh, crikey, that didn't go as well as I thought. Well, why? What was it? And sometimes the world surprises you. I gave a talk in London in February, and a member of the audience was really quite kind of intrusive, if I could put it this way. And she was having a kind of hard time accepting what I was talking, interrupting, so having a speech herself, and you have to kind of listen to people. I thought she's having a kind of an argument with herself, really. There's something going on that I'm not quite sure about. And eventually I said, look, I think you really should go. I'd almost never do such a thing. I said, I think probably for the sake of the rest of the audience, you've made your point and probably you should go. It was in a bookshop upstairs from a bookshop. And that was it. And I was kind of like, oh, I'm disappointed that happened. And I'm disappointed for her. And then the next day, the bookshop owner gets an email from the same person who said it was the best talk that she'd ever been to and how much she'd enjoyed it. And it was fabulous. And she'd bought the book and she thought that was wonderful as well. So you kind of never can tell. You think you think you know what's going on in the world, and sometimes you simply don't, actually. Other people have got things going on, and you just have to be as sort of kind as you can to them, because actually they may be saying stuff that they don't mean and they don't intend, and you shouldn't read anything into it, and you should just kind of just assume that it went well. And that was a kind of good lesson, because things like that happen when people interact. We get it wrong sometimes with people, and you just have to go, then you find out afterwards that something different was going on. So kind of the way of the world.
Well, it's good. There's a good story at the end of that. I'm glad that she did get a lot out of it. But what a funny turn of events.
Exactly. What it was.
Very curious. So let's move on to the Essex Climate Action Group. So you are the chair, one of the chairs. Can you tell us what the group's mission is and the work you do to promote climate action in the region?
Sure. So there's a number of so-called place-based climate action commissions and networks that have been established across the UK, some at county level and some at city level. So Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Belfast, some counties, Surrey, Yorkshire and Humberside, Essex, some parts of London, like Croydon, for example. And the idea behind these place-based commissions is to say, in a sense, kind of regardless of what's going on at national policy level, and we always hope and wish it would be more in whatever area we work on. We always kind of say, oh, if only policy were right, then things would be better. You know, it's kind of, that's the way it always is a little bit. And we can nudge that and change that. But that sometimes timescales are difficult and governments have a lot of things going on. So regardless of that, we say come down a level to a county, and the commission has 40 commissioners who are volunteers from the public, private and third sectors. And the idea when it was set up was to produce recommendations for Essex County Council, which doesn't cover the whole of Greater Essex. It still leaves us with two unitary authorities. But largely covers most of the county of 1.5 million people, and to make recommendations to public, private and third sector organisations about what should be done to make the transition towards net zero for the county for 2050. So 2 years ago, we produced a report with more than 100 recommendations in it, in all the kind of different areas that you can imagine, in green infrastructure, in energy, in housing, in food, in the just transition, in community engagement, in waste, pretty well all kind of areas. So that's a big agenda. But the key point behind all of that is that we wanted to say, here are 100, and there's not a list of priorities. They're just all important. But we know that you, whoever you are reading this, you're not going to do them all. You're not even kind of capable or interested in doing them all. But there'll be something here that you can act upon to make a difference to your household or your business or your school or your local authority or whatever, that will make a difference towards this kind of net zero target. So it was deliberately lots of paths rather than one path. And we were able to persuade, encourage the political leaders at Essex County Council, so the elected groups, all of them, all the political parties agreed to all 100 recommendations as a package.
Wow.
So, and I said to them beforehand, please don't pick. If this party over here picks this one and not that one, and someone else picks this one but not that one, there's just going to be an argument and we're not going to get anywhere. So I want you to agree to the whole package, I said, because it's really important. You're not going to deliver them all by agreeing to them all. You're just agreeing to them all being priorities, and that the Commission has kind of come up with helpful stuff. So that was very, very positive, very progressive. And since then, we have been working on kind of implementation in all of these areas in lots of different ways. Changes to planning policy, changes to investments in solar PV, changes in retrofit support, changes in green infrastructure, the establishment of what we called a climate focus area, which is a place-based action within Essex, which is around the Blackwater. So we defined an area around the Blackwater and the Colne estuaries, part of the Colne, and to say, right, within this area, we need focused action, and to do a lot of kind of positive changes in this area and try to use that as an exemplar. So there's lots of very encouraging things happening, and it's interesting how quickly a county can become a leader in this area by just having kind of vision and broad scope and a sense that these things are achievable rather than not achievable. And I really try to encourage us all, and I'm not, and it's not hard to do that because I think everybody understands the values and the kind of underlying approach that we have here. We don't want to have kind of arguments about the problems with this development or this housing thing over here, or this, the problem in my area is this versus the problem in that area is something else. We're trying to keep it at the strategic level within the county, but also to make that deliverable. And so we will come up with ideas that we think need to happen. So we said every business in Essex should cover their roofs with solar panels, for example. So there are 200,000 businesses in Essex. So that's not going to happen quickly, but there's a big support for solar installation within Essex. We've started saying, some of the area of kind of biggest wasted space is car parks. So why not cover every car park with solar panels? Because you also get a shading effect when the weather's hot. The cars, you can only do that in the outside part, but look on any Google Maps area of any town or village, you'll find lots of spare space. So
that's true.
That's another area where, so instead of using green space for solar, we could do it over concrete and put the cars underneath. So there are examples of, and they're only, those are two of 100 areas that I've just mentioned. And some will move quickly and some will move slowly. And I'm not too bothered about that. I'm just bothered about some movement of some sort, because we know that will be gathering agency and a sense of purpose within the county, where people feel as though something good is happening. And when we feel that something good is happening, we want to get on that train. We want to be part of it. We'll join it. And that's almost a kind of key requisite for the climate crisis, is we want people to join the possibility of doing something good.
Looking ahead, what are your hopes and goals for the future of the group and its impact on the community? What's the overall vision?
Well, I think there would be two things. One would be establishment of lots of social institutions across the county. So there've been about 30 climate groups, sometimes they call them commissions or committees or just action groups within parishes and towns at the local level across Essex, formed in the last year. So people have formed them to take action. Now, that's a really good thing. So that's a changing sort of social infrastructure. So there are 275 parishes, so we need that to happen in every parish. So, it's still a long way to go, but as people organise to do stuff, people in neighbouring areas hear about it, and then they go, "Oh, that's interesting." So you get a kind of osmosis effect where the ideas spread a little bit.
Yeah.
The second thing is actually really pushing for the kind of green economy, if we can call it that. There's lots of different terms, but ensuring that the transition that is happening to support eliminating fossil fuels, leaving every kilogram in the ground, is going to need different ways of thinking when it comes to the economy. And so that would be the kind of area, is defining this shift towards spending on capital to reduce costs. If you have capital to buy an electric vehicle, then your costs are going to be reduced because you're going to save yourself, whatever it is, 50 quid a week on filling up the car because you've got an electric vehicle. If you've got capital and you can put it into solar PV or retrofit your home, your energy costs are going to be reduced. This idea of investing in capital to reduce costs is a central principle to the green economy. So we have a job to do to persuade people that actually works and that makes a difference, and that will increase the number of jobs and improve businesses' performance and make people feel less poor. I mean, hopefully more wealthy as well. But the idea of a just transition, which is part of one of our kind of 7 focus areas, is key to this, which is to say this is something that should reduce inequality. and we should be pushing it really hard. So the transformation of the economy towards kind of green outcomes on the back of, especially on the back of renewables, is critical. And there's a thought piece to be done with that, but then there's also kind of making it happen, and that's going to be a job that'll take 5 or 10 years to really be effective with.
What inspired you to take on the leadership role in this group? And why Essex? Why the Essex community?
Well, that's where our university is. That's where I work. I live right on the border of Essex and Suffolk. So I live in the Stour Valley. I can see Essex out of one window of the room I'm in, and Suffolk on the other window.
So it's quite a personal thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it is. Yeah, and you might as well begin with your home place, really, and to kind of think about what sorts of changes can be made. And just similar sorts of things need to happen in, every location in the UK, in the world, eventually. But some people are moving really quickly and some slowly. So the challenge is to be as ambitious as we can, really, and then tell people about it. That's the key. It's not just kind of doing a bit of good stuff and then sitting quietly. It's to kind of go and say, well, actually, you know what? This is working here. You can do this somewhere else as well. So spinning off and spilling over into other areas is pretty critical as well.
I love that, spinning off. That's a great segue. I'm very interested in the author aspect of you, because I saw in your signature it says in the world's top 1% highly cited authors and papers and data sets. That's amazing. That's so cool. I read that and I was just like, gosh, how did you feel when those stats were performed to you? Were you like, whoa, check me out?
It's nice to have these sorts of measures. I mean, if it wasn't nice, I wouldn't be putting it in a signature.
Yeah.
But equally, there are kind of there are limitations with, for example, the citation culture in science, because that's not the only value. Is there a higher value in producing a lot of papers that are read and cited by other people, or having a higher value in coming up with one kind of brilliant idea that changes the world? I mean, I don't know. Who knows, really? That's kind of what we're all trying to do, is to do interesting stuff that's relevant and salient, and for other people to work on similar areas and to be noticed for that. So of course it's nice. I mean, and it's the same with books. You produce them for yourself to begin with, because that's your project that you were working on, as I was saying earlier. But you'd quite like people to kind of read them as well afterwards, because that is kind of nice. And then people feed back stuff, and then they say, oh, I like that bit and I didn't like that bit, and why don't you do this? And that's great. I love that kind of feedback. That's fab.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very curious, in your opinion, what is the role of storytelling in creating awareness and fostering a connection between people and the natural world? I think this is such an interesting question.
It is.
And
it absolutely is.
There's like an array of answers, but I'd love to hear it from you.
Well, I think I would say there's an increased interest in what story is and how relevant it is to these kind of transformational projects, these understandings of the world. And I think that's a good thing in of itself. Story is something that we've always had as humans since we developed forms of communication. The earliest forms of what we could call art, but actually when you look at it, they're stories, are the recent discovery of the hunters and animals in a cave in Sarawak. So that's 44,000 years ago. And the hunters have beaks and tails and heads of animals. So the hunters are clearly half animal and half human, or half bird and human. So they're morphing between them. Something's going on that's super interesting. And the animals are great big animals. And the humans are about the size of a leg of the animal. They're sort of swimming And you look at it and you think, that's a story. That is a story. There's something there. We don't know the full detail of it, but it's telling us something about humans and the world. And at the, one of the earliest points of the emergence of language. So we've always sat around the fire or the hearth at the time of eating. And we've sat there, and in the flickering shadows and the children looking up with eyes wide, someone's going to tell a story about what they've done that day, or a broader story about where they've come from, about foundation myths around the mountain or the forest or the river or the prairie or whatever it is. That's where people kind of tell stuff to each other. And we've always then used that as not just kind of vicarious, like, kind of soap opera type of story. Humans have always told stories in order to let people know how the world works. So stories contain moral content. They contain ideas about how to behave in the right way and what happens when we behave in the wrong way. And all stories have tricksters in them, animals with agency and activity. The fox, the hare, the raven, the coyote, spider, all, the whale, dolphin, all cultures have trickster animals, which gives kind of credibility and credence to the natural world around us. So when earlier on I was saying that the boundaries are really blurred in indigenous cultures, they're super blurred. I mean, they really aren't. They don't exist. People see that agency as there all the time. And so story is about understanding the world, understanding how we interact in it, our journeys through it, but it's also about moral content and how to behave. So I think we can use those storytelling methods now to be able to say, this is a way of kind of understanding the world. Here is kind of storytelling method to engage the public, to engage the listeners. There's a Tuscan proverb that says, a story is not beautiful if nothing is added to it. So a beautiful story is one where the audience is able to add things into it. There are enough spaces and gaps where you go, I see what's happening, and I think it's this in your mind. And so you're engaging with the story. You're investing your kind of interest and time and capability in it. In other words, you're learning about the world and how it works and how you think you might behave in that kind of context. So I think there's a real kind of opportunity for telling stories about the way the world works. And that's why I used various storytelling methods in one of my most recent books called Sea Sagas of the North, which is about,
I was gonna exactly say that, yes.
which is about the kind of the communities that look at the inwards towards the North Sea and the eastern North Atlantic. So from Iceland to Norway, Denmark, England, Scotland, Faroe Isles, and the interactions between people around a kind of body of water and the commonalities they have across the water, which are much stronger than those just inland. So a fisherman said to me in the early days of visiting more than 160 places around the North Sea and the North Atlantic, a fisherman said, 80-year-old fisherman, famed guy who'd won the kind of one of the famous prizes for being a drifter skipper and then a trawler skipper for his kind of success at catching herrings back in the day. And he said, you know what, boy, in a good kind of Suffolk accent, he said, we were much more kind and tolerant in those days when we had the fishing, because we travelled out to other places, other ports and villages around the sea, and we came back with not just fish, but stories. We came back with friendships and ideas of other places. And he said he had greater knowledge of villages in Iceland, 1,000 kilometers away, more knowledge of them than a town 10 kilometers inland. That's the remote place. The bit inland, the bit that's physically far away is not mentally far away, because people were all engaged in the fishing. Now, they were competing for the fish, for sure. But at the same time, people just kind of then sat down and said, we're in the same game. It's like, two teams of footballers or cricketers or whatever. You need